This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 75. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberley Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Well, welcome back, CBT School community. I am so happy to speak with you today. So happy to be with you today. So happy to share this moment with you. Today is an exciting day. We have an amazing person on the podcast. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. It has been such an honor to have this guest on, and I'm going to share with you just a little bit about that. But before I do, please just know that I'm here sending you out great loads of love. It's been a tough week for us here in Southern California this week. We have had some devastating fires come through my neighborhood. I've been evacuated from my office. I had 5 days out of the office, which was actually kind of nice, I will admit, but the circumstances were definitely not. And we've had, a very, very close to home shooting, which was also very, very difficult. So our community is really coming together, and I really just am sending out tons of love and light to you all and making sure I'm giving you guys a reminder to just slow down, give yourself some space to feel whatever comes up. I'm sure there are other things going on in the world as you listen to this. And, when things are hard, we have to slow down and make space for our feelings and really shine a light on what comes up for us and, make a lot of space for compassion and self-care, which is what I have done. I'm going to try to really model that to you. We didn't do a Magic Monday this week. I just had to give myself that time. And so, it's a beautiful day to do hard things. But what I've learned, you guys, is that when so many devastating things are happening, if you slow down long enough, you will see the most amazing, beautiful acts of kindness and generosity that, and that seeing that humans come together. We are an incredible tribe. So I just wanted to first send out my love to you guys and then get straight to the episode. And so that being said, let's just do it, shall we? This week we have, I feel like I need a drum roll, Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is the author of the most amazing book for depression in my mind, which is Feeling Good. This is a groundbreaking published book. I think it's sold over 5 million copies. It is brilliant. It's using a lot of cognitive skills, a lot of behavioral skills, talking us through how to manage depression, how to get back up on our feet, how to challenge depression in a way that, we're not intuitively told to handle it. And so I'm so thrilled to have Dr. David Burns with us. Now, Dr. David Burns also wrote the Feeling Good Handbook, which is for clinicians. I rely on that often in my office. He wrote When Panic Attacks, and he is the author of an upcoming book called Feeling Great, which I'm so excited to read. Another thing about Dr. Burns that I love is that he created the Burns Depression Worksheet or checklist. And this is a tool I use in my office all the time to help assess depression so that I can then determine what to prioritize in treatment. Because we have to make sure we address depression if it's showing up. And he was so great to give us some statistics about the rates of depression with those who have anxiety. He said 50% of people who have anxiety have depression, and 100% of people with depression have anxiety. And I think that that just really spoke to the importance of this conversation. I'm going to promise here that I will continue to push further into working on depression and really giving tools for depression, because I think that it's very much an important piece of the work that we need to do in the mental health field. And so I'm not going to keep chatting too much. I'm just going to take it straight to the genius work of Dr. Burns and go from there. So I hope you enjoy it. Again, sending you all big love, big hugs, and, I can't wait to share this. So have a wonderful day. Well, welcome. I am so excited to have Dr. David Burns with me today and with all of us to talk about some really, really important discussion and topics around depression and panic and those really, really difficult thoughts and cases that we get. So welcome, Dr. David Burns.
Okay, thank you for having me on your show. My phone's ringing in the background. The answering machine will pick it up shortly, so hopefully that won't bug people.
No, that's okay. Actually, usually when we do an interview, if somebody's phone or something's ringing, we just say that's a metaphor for what your brain does, right?
Yeah.
Your brain just sends off little messages and alarms.
Yeah.
So you are the author of what I call the Bible for depression, the book called Feeling Good and the Feeling Good Handbook. I think it's the book every clinician must read to help their clients. So would you tell us a little bit about how that all came about and your work?
Yeah, well, I started out in biological psychiatry like so many, young psychiatrists, and was doing research, brain chemistry, brain serotonin metabolism, because of this misguided theory that everyone had that depression was due to a chemical imbalance in the brain. And our research, even in the 1970s, showed it was extremely unlikely that that could be the cause of depression. And so I had a grant to stay at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School full-time doing brain research, but I didn't want to do research on a theory that we'd already shown was a false theory. We don't know, to this day, we don't really know the cause of depression. But I was really interested in getting my patients better, and I was giving out antidepressants and pills by the bushel. And I had very few patients who were recovering and going from depression to joy. It's great to get up in the morning, and it's wonderful to be alive. And I thought there were some real discrepancies between what the drug companies were claiming and what I was seeing in my pretty large clinical practice working with depressed people. And I was looking around for just something to add to giving out pills. And then I heard about Beck's cognitive therapy, and the department chairman said, why don't you attend his weekly seminar and see he has this new thing that thoughts cause depression and you can change the way you think and change the way you feel. I said, that sounds like so much rubbish. That's like Norman Vincent Peale's power of positive thinking. And I'm working with severe, suicidal, overwhelmingly depressed individuals. And that just sounds dopey to me. And also, when I saw Beck, I said, he looks a little like a con artist. He would wear these goofy bow ties and I'm not saying that he is, but that's how he struck me. Mm. And then the department chairman said, well, why don't you, go to his seminar and try these new techniques out on a few of your patients and, you can satisfy yourself that it doesn't work. And so I would go to his weekly seminar, and there were only about, I'd say, 7 cognitive therapists in the world at the time, and we were all there in one room pretty much. And I would always present a very difficult case that I was stuck with, someone I was stuck with, or someone who was actively suicidal. So I knew that would get his attention. So he would say, well, we better work with Dr. Burns's case first. And then I'd get all this cool feedback. And I'd go and try it out with my patients, and they started to turn the corner on their depressions. And they said they wanted more. And at first, I couldn't believe it. I said, well, why is this working? Maybe because it's new or I'm enthusiastic. But then over time, I began to see it really was true that when we're depressed, it's our thoughts that are causing the depression. Number two, those thoughts seem very believable, like I'm worthless, I'll never get better. But those thoughts are distorted. That depression and anxiety, too, are the world's oldest cons. And then when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. And it really did have something to it. And so I sent my grant money back and I left the full-time faculty. I said, I'll stay on the voluntary faculty, but I want to develop a clinical practice and really help to develop cognitive therapy. So those were the early days. And the reason I wrote Feeling Good was just because I got so excited. I wanted to share with people, what I was saying that was so, quasi unbelievable, really. And then what we were talking about before, you started your recording, was that I never intended Feeling Good to be a self-help book. I was just writing a book about depression and new approaches and how to think about it. And I thought maybe if people are in treatment, they could read, like cognitive therapists like yourself, then patients could read various chapters for homework between their weekly sessions, and it would accelerate their recovery just because they would be learning. But then this psychologist, he was at University of Alabama, Forrest Gogan, he started to ask the question because people started noticing when they would give Feeling Good to people who were depressed, a lot of them were recovering. In fact, I just had 2 reports of that yesterday. I was supervising one of the psychiatric residents, and he said someone had called him to make an appointment with severe depression and failed previous therapy. And so he made an appointment for the fellow for Tuesday of this week and just talked to him for 15 minutes and said, before your session, go out and get this book, Feeling Good. And then the fellow came in and said, I'm here to terminate therapy because I read that book and I did the written exercises and my depression and anxiety have vanished. And then another colleague had exactly the same experience. And so Forrest Gogan, a research psychologist, said maybe there's something to it. Let's see if this book really has antidepressant properties. So he did 8 or 10 research studies on the book Feeling Good, giving it to people who were seeking treatment for severe major depressive episodes. And when they would come to the medical center requesting treatment, and then he would say, you have to stay on this waiting list for 4 weeks before you can see your doctor. In the meantime, read this book. And then they would study them once a week. And what they found is by the time the 4 weeks had gone by, 2/3 of them had improved so much that they no longer wanted or needed any kind of treatment. And so I got to thinking about that because it was just mind-blowing to me. I first read about it in the New York Times. I didn't even know he was doing this research. And so then lately, see, that was the technology of 1990 or 1980. That's when the book was first published. And since that time, as I was telling you, I have a psychotherapy development group at Stanford. In the last 10 years, we've made tremendous new breakthroughs in the treatment of depression, anxiety, relationship problems, and habits and addictions. And we're keeping all the great stuff from cognitive therapy, but adding tremendous new components that melt away resistance. See, when cognitive therapy came in, we all thought everything was cognitions. It's all thoughts control everything, your emotions, your behaviors. And we just thought resistance was, rubbish stuff for psychoanalysts and people who really weren't interested in helping their patients change. But I discovered I was really wrong about that. And motivation and resistance play an incredible role, as big as the role of cognition in how we think and feel and behave. And you see this politically. People believe what they want to believe rather than what facts show sometimes. And so we've developed new, what you call resistance busting techniques or resistance melting techniques, depending on how you want to think about it. And we've combined those with all of the cognitive and behavioral stuff. And now we're seeing improvement at speeds faster than I ever would have believed possible. And so the new book, Feeling Great, will have all of the new stuff as well as, the pure gold that existed in Feeling Good and still exists in that book.
Right.
So,
are you going to bring out the sequel, Feeling Fantastic?
Well, we'll say, how Feeling Great does. People have suggested that title. I like titles like that because that's what the book really is about, because it's not only about recovery from depression and anxiety disorders. I have what I call 100% recovery and 200% recovery. 100% recovery is when all of your symptoms vanish. 200% recovery is when you go into a state of enlightenment and just sheer joy. And that really is what the new book will be about, is feeling fantastic. But people advise me I use too many superlatives. If you're more low key, you'll sound more scientific.
I love it. Well, we can maybe still have a sequel at some point.
Yeah, hopefully.
For the listeners, they already know, but I treat a lot of anxiety disorders, but often there is secondary depression or primary depression occurring as well.
Almost always, in fact, the research shows that 50% of anxious patients will be depressed and 100% of depressed patients will be anxious.
Right. That's really interesting. I mean, I think that's very much mirrored in my practice.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of, if it's okay with you, sort of just run a few common distorted thoughts or thought errors that I see and get your thoughts on what you would do, because I know that, in our community, in the CBT school community, which is the podcast, there's a lot of thoughts around, that a lot of the community don't have a therapist and are doing it on their own and fighting their fight every day. Before we move into specifics, what advice do you have for those who don't have a therapist and are kind of doing it in an isolated environment? What advice would you give them besides to pick up your amazing book?
Well, to pick up my amazing book, I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is reach out to people like that. And now I'm hoping if I can get some funding to develop an electronic version of myself, an app that will be even more powerful than the books. That's what I was meeting with some people about last night. I think there's a tremendous amount that people can do to help themselves, but I don't think that's for everyone. Sometimes people are just so hopeless and suicidal and so distorted in their thinking, in a kind of blizzard of depression is the way I think about it, or panic. I've also seen blizzards of anxiety. And certainly if you're trying things on your own and not having much success, it doesn't hurt to get some help from a compassionate and skilled therapist. But the disheartening thing to me, sadly, I give free training to psychotherapists at Stanford from the Bay Area because I think there's such a desperate need for training that the skill level of some therapists is not good. They have, this sounds cynical to say it, like schmoozing behind closed doors with the occasional bit of advice thrown in. And sadly, I don't think that model of therapy leads to a lot of recovery or changes in folks. But I think we've got a tremendous problem in the United States and world round, because I think the training of therapists needs to be upgraded tremendously. People are just churning out therapists of every kind, and the skill level sometimes really needs to be improved. And then, will pills help? Sadly, a lot of the research indicates that we've been oversold. The thing I saw way back when I was doing full-time biological psychiatry has proven to be right, that the chemicals called antidepressants have very few, if any, antidepressant or anti-anxiety effects above and beyond their placebo effect. And I think that's been another problem, because so many people in communities, they don't have a therapist. They go to the family doctor, they get a pill, an antidepressant, and they end up staying on these medications for years. And if you're measuring their depression scores, nothing is really changing significantly. So that's one of the reasons I'm now focusing more on books that were really intended to help people with depression and anxiety, use the tools, and hopefully a significant proportion of those people who read and try the tools will be helped by them. Mm-hmm. Also, you're saying if people don't have resources, they can go to my website, feelinggood.com, and I have tons of free resources for therapists and their patients and people who don't have therapists. Like my Feeling Good podcast, we just did podcast 101. It occurred to me I need to link on my website to podcast number 1 so new people can start from the beginning. But I get every day emails from people say, oh, I listened to your podcast 72 or whatever, and it blew my mind, and I'm feeling so much better. And so I think there's a lot that people can do to help themselves if you get the right tools.
Right. I agree. I love your podcast. I particularly love the 50 tools in 50 minutes. That was incredible.
Oh, did you like that one?
Yeah.
Have you heard the live therapy ones, like with Marilyn and stuff?
I was just checking it out a couple of weeks ago. It's so incredible.
Yeah, the live podcasts, or any of the listeners too, are dramatic, like the one with Marilyn, who was a colleague, and she asked if, she said she was depressed and upset. I said, well, I'd be glad to I treat therapists in our training groups for free. And so she came and sat down with Fabrice, my co-host, and one of my colleagues, Matt May. I like to have co-therapy when we do podcasts because it moves faster. And then she announced that she went to the doctor for a routine doctor visit, and he checked her out and said, you have stage 4 lung cancer. And she went into extreme panic and rage because she's never been a smoker, severe depression and shame. And it was a great podcast because, well, we published it as 3. It was just one session, but she experienced a complete elimination of symptoms and went from just kind of sobbing and rage and intense, horrible feelings to just laughter and really enlightenment at the end. And it so underscores that it's not what happens to us, but the way we think about it.
Right.
And then that was about a year ago, and then she came to my intensive in San Francisco as a helper. And she was just looking great and made tremendous contributions to that training program. But I think the live therapy sessions, there's one from a fellow named Mark who thought he was a bad father. Mm. There's one from a fellow named Lee who had a significant marital problem. And there's one from a woman named Daisy who thought she wouldn't be able to have children, and she had the thought, you can't be happy in this culture without children. And I think when people hear it's actual real therapy, but they were all completed their treatment in one session. Wow. And when you see that those transformations in other people, I think it can be really, really helpful to you as well. And I'm going to be trying to add more and more of the live therapies. Some are audio only to protect the identity of the person, and some give me permission for audio and video.
Right. Would you share more about that it's not what happens to you, but how you think about it?
Yeah. When that idea has been around for probably at least 2,000 years, going back to the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who said people are disturbed not by things or events, but by the views we take of them. In other words, our thoughts create all of our emotions at every moment. Like right now, I'm having thought, wow, this is a really fun person to talk to. It's fun being on the show, and and that makes me feel really good. But I was down at LA at the Evolution Psychotherapy Conference, and at one point, I gave a number of presentations. I had the thought, oh my gosh, I'm outclassed here. I'm over the hill. I'm no good, type of thing. No one's going to want to hear my presentations. Do you know what I mean? I mean, mm-hmm. It seemed so real at the time. And then I was feeling, just ashamed and kind of worthless. It's just what you're thinking, what you're telling yourself. And when we fall into these black holes of depression or anxiety, if you write down your negative thoughts, you'll see you have these thoughts, I'm a loser, I'm no good, there's nothing special about me, I've screwed up, or you blame yourself, or if you're anxious, you have been giving yourself these danger thoughts, like, if I get on that plane, I know it's going to crash, or if you're having panic attacks, you have the thought, oh my gosh, I'm about to have a heart attack and die because you're feeling tightness in your chest, or you're anxious about something that you're not dealing with, and you have a panic attack, or you think I'm on the verge of going crazy, or whatever it is. And it's those thoughts that are creating your symptoms. It's not what's actually happening to you. And those thoughts, although they seem so real, they're fraud, they're distorted, they're not true. And so that's kind of the history of it. When I wrote Feeling Good, the publisher wouldn't support it initially. They didn't think there'd be any interest in the book. And I had to try to do everything myself, and it was hard, because there's rejection from, TV shows or, radio. Nobody was interested in that. It was a boring book on depression, but it started selling, by word of mouth, and the publishers would print a few thousand, it would sell out, and then they'd print a few thousand more and it would sell out. But I got a letter from a fellow who said, I've read your book and it's pretty good, but this idea that only our thoughts can create our moods is nonsensical. He said, imagine if you're trapped on the railroad tracks and there's a train coming at 60 miles an hour. You're going to feel panic, and you don't have to put a thought in your mind to feel the panic. And they said, what do you think about that? And when I read that, I was sitting in a taxi coming home from the airport, and about a mile from my house, which is in outskirts of Philadelphia, it goes across the railroad track. And I noticed on the track, there was an old car driving down the railroad track. And it made no sense. And then I looked in the other direction, and this is a place where big, huge mile-long trains come through. They don't stop. They come through 60 or 70 miles an hour. And I said, if the taxi driver stopped, I got to get that guy off the railroad tracks or he's going to be killed. So I ran up, and the tracks were on like a kind of a little gravel mound type of thing. It's a little elevated. So I went up and pounded on the window. I mean, he was only going about 2 miles an hour. And he stopped, and there was this older gentleman there, and he rolled down the window very slowly, and he looked at me and he says, can you tell me where City Line Avenue is? And I said, listen, City Line Avenue is about 8 miles in the other direction, but you're on the railroad tracks and you're about to hit by a train. I want you to back up to the road so I can get you out of the way of the train. So he backed up and slowly was trying to adjust his car. I was saying, back it in this direction. And the train started putting on its horn, like, we're going to be there in maybe 30 seconds type of thing. And he finally got to where he was on the road, but the nose of his car was over the tracks. And so I stood in front of him, and the train was now about 15 seconds from impact. It had its horn on solid. And I said, back up like this with my hands, shouting, back up. And no, I think I wanted him. No, back up. Instead, he went forward about 6 feet, and the train hit him at about 70 miles an hour. The train had its brakes on, but it was still going extremely fast and ripped the car in half. And the front half of the driver was about maybe 20 feet from where the collision happened. It was knocked through So I ran over to the driver's side. I expected to see a decapitated corpse. And the train had hit about an inch behind his head. And you know how when you pull out, if there's glasses on a table and you pull out the cloth thing real fast, they don't move that much. And apparently that had happened because he didn't seem injured at all. And he just looked at me and smiled. And he said, now, what direction exactly did you have City Line Avenue? And I said, listen, you've just been hit by a train. And he said, I have not. And I said, you have. And he says, that's ridiculous. And I said, oh, is it ridiculous? What do you think all this broken glass is all over you? He says, you're right. Somebody seems to have smashed the windows. And I said, where do you think the rear half of your car is? And he turned around. He saw that half of his car was missing. And he says, where is this train? And I said, look, it's right there. It's 10 feet from here. And if you look there, there's the conductor and the engineers running toward us at this very moment. And he says, this is wonderful. And I says, well, why is this wonderful? He says, maybe I can sue. And so here is the same event. Mm. And I'm feeling terrified because I'm saying this guy's going to get killed. And he's thinking, this is wonderful. Now, what explains this? Well, I got back, the police came, they took him to the hospital, but there was nothing wrong with him. I gave them my story, got in the taxi and went home. The next day I was jogging past that spot and I saw this man maybe in his 50s looking through the rubble. And I stopped and said, yeah, there was a kind of an accident here yesterday. Yeah, he says, yeah, somebody saved my father's life. He was hit by a train. And I said, well, I think that was me because I was here and I couldn't understand why your father was driving down the railroad tracks. And he seemed very confused. And he says, my father has Alzheimer's disease and he lost his driver's license 10 years ago. Or maybe dementia, maybe not Alzheimer, maybe just some form of dementia. And he said after dinner, he got the car keys and snuck out and took the car for a drive. And so here's a fellow, the same situation, and he doesn't have the thought, I'm about to die. So he's not feeling any anxiety, and he's feeling positive thoughts. It's the greatest thing in the world. I'm going to make a ton of money. I told him, no, you'll be lucky if they don't sue you. and my thoughts were very different. Right. And so that's the basis, but it's such a basic idea. It's kind of a Buddhist idea. And when the Buddha was alive, he was also trying to teach this concept. And although I've heard over 100,000 followers, only 2 or 3 of them were able to grasp this idea. But we create our own emotional reality at every moment of every day, but we don't realize it. So we feel like victims of these forces beyond our control. And that's why depression is so cruel, and anxiety too, because you think you really are worthless, that life really is no good, that you really are in danger, whether you have shyness or public speaking anxiety or whatever. And so the only thing that's new, because the idea goes back, maybe 2,500 years, is that just powerful, fast-acting techniques to help people crush these thoughts that create so much pain, so much misery, so you can get back to, feeling good, feeling great, or feeling fantastic.
So let me talk to you about a couple of examples. Often when I do a lot of exposure therapy, right? So a lot of clients with obsessive compulsive disorder, they're doing a lot of compulsions. And so we work at exposing them to their fear, right? Testing the evidence.
Yeah. When I'm treating any form of anxiety, I'm using the cognitive model, the exposure model, the hidden emotion model, and the motivational model. So, and within those 4 categories, there may be 30 really powerful and helpful techniques. But you're right, the exposure and response prevention has to be part of your treatment package. I went to a workshop on exposure when I was just started my practice. I was still learning about a lot of stuff, and it was one of the top guys in the world from England. He was supposed to be the world's top exposure guy. And he started the workshop by saying, exposure is the only thing that works for anxiety, and it always works, and nothing else is helpful. That's the end of the workshop. Any questions? And there's certainly something to that. It's very important. And then he gave a really funny example. He said, I had this patient with OCD, and he had heard, when you step on a crack and you'll break your mother's back. And so he said, I persuaded him to use exposure. So we went to a high school gymnasium on a Saturday, and there's all these, boards on the floor with cracks all over the place, because they're so I said, so get in there and start stomping on those cracks. And the guy's very resistant, but agreed to do it. He goes in, he's so anxious, he's dizzy, and he's staggering around, and he's stepping on all of these cracks. And then the fellow gets an emergency call that one of his relatives just died. The fellow who's doing this workshop says, now, if you were a therapist, what would you say next?
And what would you say?
Well, none of us could come up with anything. So I asked him, what did you say? He says, I told him, get in there. That's great. Get in there and see if you can kill another one.
That's what I would say too. Exactly.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Absolutely. I would just say, we don't know whether they're linked, and move on forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Good for you.
So
but it brings to life an important idea that not only do patients with anxiety fear exposure, most therapists fear exposure. And in the United States, only a quarter, roughly, surveys have indicated of therapists who work with anxiety disorders use exposure because the patient hypnotizes the therapist into believing that they're too fragile for exposure, and the therapist gives in.
Right, which is a big part of what I wanted to bring you in, because, I feel like so blessed to be a part with some incredible community of therapists who are really skilled at treating anxiety.
Oh, how neat.
And the biggest, we talked about resistance. One of the biggest resistance that we have that I feel very confident in battling, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about, is this thought that I can't do it. So let's say if somebody's afraid of driving over a bridge, let's say they're afraid that bridge will collapse, or, it could be any fear. And they're standing and they're, I think you use the term like test the evidence. Is that what you'd say? You would test the evidence?
Well, see, I never use any kind of helpful techniques until I've accomplished two things first. First, I would be empathizing at the start of every session. And after 20 or 30 minutes, if you're skilled at empathy, you can usually get really a tremendous therapeutic relationship. And the way I find out, it sounds dopey, I say to the patient, how would you grade me so far on empathy in terms of understanding how you're thinking, how you're feeling inside, and creating a warm, accepting, safe environment? Would you give me an A, a B, a C, a D? What would you give me? And it sounds dopey to me to say that, but it doesn't sound dopey to the patients. And they might give you an A or an A plus, but more often than not, they'll say, oh, I'll give you a B plus. And then I say, great, that's good. Now tell me the part I'm missing. And then they'll tell you some part that for whatever reason, they haven't been able to share with you. And then if you paraphrase that, then they say, oh, now you're getting an A plus. Right. But you've got to get your A on empathy. And then in the old days, most cognitive therapists go from empathy to methods. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with cognitive therapy, because there's tremendous resistance that has to be dealt with first. And if you have a patient with anxiety, you have what I call outcome resistance and process resistance. The outcome resistance means if you could press a magic button and be cured, would you press the magic button? Mm. And every patient, oh, yeah, I'd press that magic button. And then you say, yeah, but let's look at some other aspects here. What does your anxiety and depression and shame show about you that's positive and awesome? And what are some tremendous benefits of your depression and anxiety and all these negative thoughts and feelings? Mm. And the big outcome resistance thing with anxiety, with every single anxiety disorder, the main thing that makes a patient think maybe it's not such a good idea to press that magic button and be cured is called magical thinking. Mm. They believe that something terrible will happen if they're cured. Mm. And this is very pronounced in OCD. Like a patient of mine was washing her hands 50 times a day. And I said, suppose you were cured and
from the washing.
From this compulsion to washing and your fears, and then you'd wash your hands once or twice a day or whatever is normal. What do you think would happen? And she said, oh, that would be awful because my hands would get contaminated. And I said, yeah, okay, now let's assume your hands get contaminated. Now what are you afraid of? What's the worst that could happen? Well, then I would touch my children and they'd get contaminated. Okay, and then what's the worst that could happen? Well, then they'll die of leukemia. Now, that's pretty intense, and that's called outcome resistance. That's the system that's really making her cling to the anxiety. And this is true of every person listening to this podcast and everyone in the world who has any kind of anxiety, performance anxiety, or whatever. And if you don't deal with the outcome resistance and melt away the outcome resistance, you'll have limited effectiveness with any tools. And then process resistance is different. Process resistance means you do want to get better, and your reluctance to get better has been made minimal, but you don't want to do what you have to do to get better. And so in the case of anxiety, that's exposure.
Right. Being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that personally because when I wrote my book, When Panic Attacks, I started counting up all the anxiety disorders that I've had. And I can show you the way out of the woods and what a joy that's going to be.
Right. So what would you say if someone said, I can't do this hard thing, whether you've given them an activity schedule that they have to go out and do something in the day because they're so depressed or anxious? How would you respond to the thought, I can't do it?
Well, what you're saying is it's not true that you can't do it. What you're saying is you don't want to do it. And if you don't want to do it, I say, God bless you. I totally respect that. Is there anything else I can help you with?
And then?
Well, then they can either play ball or go find a therapist who will continue to talk about their childhood for another 5 years. It's it's called gentle ultimatum and sitting with open hands, that if you want me to work with you, this is something you're going to have to do. You have to, first of all, deal with the patient's resistance, the process resistance up front. And then when it comes time to push, you have to push.
Right.
But you have to be getting an A on empathy to do this, because if you don't have that warm, trusting relationship, you don't have the cash in the bank, so to speak, to really push the patient when it comes time to confront the fear.
Right. So true. So very true. Often I've had a lot of clients who've had depression, and we've worked on their depression using many of your wonderful skills. And then they feel very confident with their ability to manage it. But then they go into a stage of fear of becoming depressed again. What would you suggest
relapse
for that?
prevention training is important, and I do it with every patient before I terminate therapy, and it takes about 30 minutes max. And there's 3 components to relapse prevention training. One component is tell the patient you don't need to worry about relapse because it's 100% certainty that you'll relapse for the rest of your life over and over. It's just part of being human. No one is entitled to be happy all the time. But the good news is whenever you relapse, it'll always be exactly the same negative thoughts, and the tools I've just taught you will always work for you for the rest of your life. And let's prepare for that now. Let's pretend it's 3 weeks from now and you've relapsed. You've had 3 glorious weeks, and you have a fight with your spouse on a Friday night and you wake up horribly depressed. What are you going to be telling yourself, and how are you going to be feeling? We fill out what I call a daily mood log, which the event, the emotions, and the negative thoughts, but we're imagining a future negative event. And then they all have the same thoughts. This proves the therapy didn't work.
Right.
This proves I'm a hopeless case. I'll never recover. I thought I was feeling better for 3 weeks, but I was just fooling myself because under the surface, I was the same worthless human being. And then we identify the distortions in those thoughts, which is easy because today the patient feels terrific, right? We're doing this at the moment of recovery. And then I become the negative part of their brain. And I say, let's imagine now it's 3 weeks, and I'm going to verbalize these things to you and see if you can defeat me. And I have them record this on their cell phone so that they can play it when they relapse. And we can do it right now. And I'm going to be your negative self, and you be your positive self. And we'll pretend that you've relapsed and see if you can defeat me. Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Well, you thought you had recovered from your depression and anxiety, and you had 3 pretty good weeks, but now you're more depressed than you've ever been in your entire life. And this proves that the therapy didn't work. It was just a flash in the pan.
Right. And so I might say something along the lines of, you've learnt the tools.
You speak in the first person, I.
So, and I'm the client.
Well, we're both the client.
Yeah.
You're the positive client. I'm the negative client.
I have learnt the tools, and I'm going to use the tools that have been so helpful for me. And it's okay if I stumble, but I will be absolutely persistent in using the tools that I've learnt.
Yeah, and that's a good, powerful response. And I would say to the patient who won, or the client who won, they'd just say, I won. I'd say big or small, they'd say big or huge, they'd say huge. Now, if they didn't win huge, I'd do a role reversal and model for them how to defeat that thought.
Right.
And then I would just keep hitting them with the other relapse thoughts, as well as the thoughts that caused their depression and anxiety in the first place.
Right.
And then that's it. And they're armed for relapse. Relapse, once they know it's inevitable, but they get the idea they can pop out of it quickly, it seems to take all the sting out. And I had very few patients who came back for tune-ups following the completion of therapy. I probably had I know I've had at least 35,000 therapy sessions with severely depressed and anxious patients, and probably less than a dozen of them ever came back for a tune-up after we'd completed therapy. And in those cases, all but one of them, it was just 1 or 2 sessions, and then they were on their way again. So, but if the therapist doesn't do the relapse prevention training, you're really asking for trouble, because then the patient has this wrong idea, I'm going to be happy forever. That's positive distortion. And then they may become suicidal, and the therapist loses credibility when they relapse.
Right.
But if you've prepared them, all of that is antidoted.
Right. So one more question before we finish up. So if someone, just so we role play, if someone had the thought, there's no point, right? So they've done the work, and then they've hit by another wave of depression, and their thought is like, what's the point of this? This is hard. This sucks, kind of thing.
Well, that would be another relapse thought. And
Right.
so if I'm the negative self and you're the positive self, I'll say, yeah, but you're depressed again. Maybe you had 3 good weeks, but you're depressed again, and this sucks. You might as well guff up. So you're a hopeless case, and now you see that you're really a worthless human being, and that's the ultimate truth, so you have to face it. How's that?
Right. What would you say to that?
Well, you're the positive.
I would say our brains are highly neuroplastic, and that by continuing to do the work, this is something that we will just continue to work on, and you have the tools. But
I have the tools.
I have the tools, yes. I'm so used to being the therapist.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Now, did you win big? Did you win? Who won?
I feel like that's a win, but not a big win.
So now do a role reversal. You be the negative self, and I'll be the positive self.
So there's no point. You've tried this, and you're the case that won't work. You're the one case that Dr. Burns can't fix because you're worthless.
Well, actually, he did fix me. The tools did work. 3 weeks ago, I recovered after decades of depression. I've had 3 great weeks. Last night, I had a fight with my wife. I forgot to use the 5 secrets of effective communication. We went to bed angry. I woke up depressed. And this is just a part of life. I have to pick up the tools again and use them. I have a problem far greater than, having a fight with my wife and being depressed. I have another problem much worse than the one you mentioned just now.
What would that be?
Listening to your bullshit.
So that's it. You basically call BS.
Yeah, a lot of the negative stuff, but it's whatever works for the client. And you go back and forth, and I will never discharge a client until they can absolutely crush all of the relapse thoughts ahead of time, as well as crush all the thoughts that cause their depression or anxiety in the first place.
Right. Well, I feel like this is a really great time just to sort of talk about your upcoming book, if you want to just share.
Oh, sure. The Feeling Great is the working title. I'm in a draft. I'm about probably 3/4 of the way through a draft. Then I'll send it to a number of publishers, see who wants to publish it. It could be out probably about a year from now, I would guess, at the earliest. But I'm very excited about it, and it has all of the cool things we've been doing and more, but also all the new techniques to melt away resistance and to boost motivation. It's got, everything that Feeling Good had, and 30 or more years of innovation and development since that time. And so I'm just really grateful that I have a chance to write it, because I love writing. And I'm really hopeful it will touch people in the same way that Feeling Good did.
Right. I'm so excited. But I think in the meantime, everyone should have that Feeling Good book right next to their bed.
Yeah, if you're depressed, or if you have anxiety, struggling with anxiety disorders, the book When Panic Attacks is like Feeling Good, but it's on all of the anxiety disorders.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I am so honored and grateful for your time. I feel like this has been really helpful for those. We talk a lot about anxiety, but we don't talk a lot about depression. So I feel like this has been absolutely just so beautiful as an icing on the cake.
Well, thank you so much. Have a good day, and congratulations on what you've done. You're a great host, a great interviewer. It's just my pleasure. I was humbled and honored to be on your show. Thank you. Thank
you. And what I'll do for the listeners is all of the links to Dr. David Burns will be in the show notes, so you can hear more about him there.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.